Días otra vez. Seguimos en temática forense. Bueno, es para mí, para nosotros, una inmensa alegría y un privilegio recibir en este 15º Congreso Internacional de Lingüística y recibir también en la Universidad Complutense de Madrid a Rui Sousa-Silva, que es, sin lugar a dudas, una referencia imprescindible, ineludible para todos aquellos que estamos interesados y trabajamos en el ámbito de la lingüística forense. Rui Sousa-Silva es doctor en lingüística aplicada, con especialización en lingüística forense por la Universidad de Aston, en Reino Unido. Es profesor titular de la Facultad de Letras de la Universidad de Oporto, investigador y coordinador científico del Centro de Lingüística de la misma universidad. Es miembro del Comité Científico del Máster en Traducción y Servicios Lingüísticos y coordinador del curso de especialización en lingüística forense. Sus investigaciones en este ámbito tienen una importante trayectoria y reconocimiento internacional, especialmente en las áreas de análisis de autoría, detección y análisis de plagio y ciberdelincuencia. Bueno, es autor y coautor de numerosísimos artículos científicos sobre la temática, coeditor de la revista internacional bilingüe Language and Law, que es una revista también de referencia en el ámbito de la lingüística forense. Participó también en la edición del Handbook of Forensic Linguistics, publicado por Routledge. Es presidente del Grupo de Trabajo Lingüística Computacional de Cost Action, Language in the Human Machine Era. Y por último, me gustaría también destacar, porque ha pasado por algo similar, que fue, no sé si presidente o comisario del 13º Congreso de la Asociación Internacional de Lingüística Legal y Forense, que se celebró hace unos años, en 2017, en Porto, que fue dedicada a los nuevos desafíos para la lingüística forense. Como pueden observar ya del título de su presentación, que ya vemos en pantalla, nos va a hablar de ciberdelincuencia, de plagio y de otros demonios en la era del texto generado por máquinas. En definitiva, nos hablará de asuntos que constituyen el centro de su investigación más relevante, como comentaba al principio, y que son, sin duda, hoy están en el centro del interés científico y social. Muchas gracias. Tienes la palabra.
afraid of this. So, it so happens that at a certain point, he wrote a manifesto. It was called Industrial Society and Its Future. And when he wrote the manifesto, he sent it to the FBI and said, well, if you publish this manifesto, I will stop sending the letter bombs. And the FBI spoke to the media, especially the Washington Post and the New York Times, and the newspaper said, well, we're not giving in to terrorists, so we won't publish that. The FBI continued to insist, and after some, this is quite ironic because at some point there was a newspaper or a media that volunteered to publish the manifesto, and that was Playboy. And Ted Kaczynski said, well, that's not the sort of medium I'm interested in. And eventually, the manifesto was published in the Washington Post, and the FBI immediately got a call from someone saying, well, I'm not sure about this, but I read the manifesto, and it feels like I immediately thought about my brother, who I haven't seen for a long while. So the FBI started investigating, started analyzing. They hired a linguist. They started analyzing the language, and then eventually they got to Ted Kaczynski, and that's how forensic linguistics attracted all this media attention. So this is one of the applications of forensic linguistics, which is assist the investigation or give evidence in cases, in legal cases. And one of the main applications is analyzing unknown or disputed authorship. And in this case, we can attribute authorship. For example, imagine I've got a threat. I've been threatened here at the Complutense, and we don't know if that threat came from Mercedes or from Marianella. So we knew for certain that it was one of them. What we could do is analyze the language and attribute the text to either of them. But in some other cases, it's not that easy, especially in cases involving social linguistic profiling. And I will tell you about the case I worked on involving social linguistic profiling, which is, it is quite hard. I mean, looking at the text and trying to see if that text was written by a man or a woman, a teenager or a young adult. I mean, it's all very difficult. And I mentioned the case of Ted Kaczynski, but forensic linguistics doesn't mean or doesn't work just to help the police. And in this case, I'd like to tell you about the case of Derek Bentley. This was one of the first cases, not very, it didn't attract much of the media attention, but it was one of the first cases of forensic linguistics. This boy is Derek Bentley. Derek Bentley was in the 1960s seen climbing up the rooftop of a warehouse in London, and the police were called. They immediately started following them, Derek Bentley and his friend, Chris Craig. At some point, everyone knew that Chris Craig had a gun, and then the voice of Derek Bentley was heard saying, "Let him have it, Chris." So the police interpreted this as saying, "Shoot him." A shot was heard, one of the policemen was killed, and Derek Bentley and Chris Craig was charged with murder. What happened then was that Derek Bentley was 19 years old, so he wasn't a minor anymore. So whereas Chris Craig was sentenced to life, Derek Bentley was sentenced to death. He was hanged in the 1960s for murder. Now, the thing is, a forensic linguist was later called to investigate this case because the language in Derek Bentley's confession was odd. And what I mean by odd is that the style was inconsistent with Derek Bentley's writing, because Derek Bentley had an IQ of about 90, and in his statement to the police, he used several examples of very sophisticated linguistics. For example, he used the postposition of the adverb. So instead of saying, "Then we climbed onto the rooftop," you would say, "We then climbed to the rooftop." And this meant that the language used was consistent with the language of the police. So the court concluded that, well, after all, there is evidence that Derek Bentley might not have confessed. His confession was actually forced by the police. And he was given posthumous pardon. I mean, it didn't help much because he had already been murdered, but anyway, he was given his posthumous pardon. So I've been talking about forensic linguistics, but I haven't defined it yet. So what is forensic linguistics? Well, forensic linguistics can be defined in both a broad and a narrow sense. In a broad sense, it includes 3 sub-areas. It can focus on the written language of the law, on interaction in the legal process, for example, how the police interviews a victim or a suspect, and language as evidence, which is the main area of forensic linguistics. And when we talk about forensic linguistics in a narrow sense, we talk about language as evidence. So authorship analysis, social linguistic profiling, disputed meanings, and so on and so forth. So this is the main, when we talk about forensic linguistics, we are referring mostly to this field of analysis, but we can see it in a broader sense to include those 3 areas. And this is what I will be focusing on today. So another application of forensic linguistics, I've talked about authorship analysis. Another application is analysis of plagiarism. Turrell, which is one of the pioneers of forensic linguistics in the world and in Spain in particular, always said that plagiarism is the other side of the coin of authorship. So you have authorship on one side and plagiarism analysis on the other. So analysis, when we talk about plagiarism, we necessarily need to talk about the analysis of textual reuse, and this includes not only plagiarism, but for example, copyright infringement as well. And here comes another problem for forensic linguists and for everyone, which is the definition of plagiarism. I spoke to many people over the last dozens of years about plagiarism, and several people said, well, you know, this is not plagiarism because this is not an academic assignment, as if plagiarism was restricted to the academy. And that's not the case. And if we go back to the traditional definition of plagiarism, we see that plagiarism is usually taking off someone else's work or words or ideas and passing it off as one's own. But there is something that I added here. So in my definition, I include intentionally or knowingly. And some old scholars of forensic linguistics, for example, Malcolm Coulthard, we had an argument about this. Because he said, well, as a linguist, you cannot detect intention. And I said, well, that's true. I'm not a psychologist, so I don't know what goes on in people's minds. But as linguists, we can identify communicative intentions. And if we look at plagiarized texts, we can actually find traces that that person in particular wanted to plagiarize. Well, they knew that they were plagiarizing and they did it intentionally, or they knew that they were doing it and did nothing to prevent it. So this is the basic principle underlying the way I see plagiarism. And why do I think that considering intentionality is important? Because the courts decide on cases of plagiarism based on intention. So if we go to a legal dictionary, and if you go to a legal dictionary, for example, Gardner's, and look for the entry for plagiarism, you will see that it mentions intentionality. And that's an important step in that case. Now, I meant that, I said that plagiarism doesn't apply simply to the academy. And this is one classic case of plagiarism. You know, that a while ago, some countries, including, or especially the United States, the United Kingdom, and they also convinced somehow Portugal and Spain to align with them, decided to invade Iraq. And this decision was based on a report prepared by the British intelligence services, and they decided to invade Iraq because they said, well, they have weapons of mass destruction, so let's invade them. And after they were invaded, a journalist, an English journalist, found out that the report was not original. It was plagiarized from a research article written by a master's student in the US. And if you look at it, this is what we have here. So this is the original, that is the derivative version produced by the British intelligence services. And you see that it's basically a poor case of a student plagiarism. It's exactly the same. There are only very minor changes. Basically, some of them are just adjusting the spelling to the British, from the American to the British spelling. And then there are some cases of intensifying the threat. For example, the original author said monitoring, and the report said spying. So let's invade them. And this is very interesting because it shows that plagiarism can have serious consequences, and that's not just in the academy, it's also everywhere in the world. Now, I mentioned Turrell a little while ago, and Turrell did a very exciting work about plagiarism in translation. So she was not worried about, or she wasn't focused on analyzing cases where someone translates from another language and plagiarizes that text. She was focusing on one translation that plagiarized another translated text. And she focused in this very interesting, I would recommend reading this paper because it's really exciting. She compared 4 translations of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar into Spanish. And the thing is, there were these 4 cases, and Vázquez Montalbán was accused of plagiarizing Pujante. And what she did to demonstrate, well, you know, this is a translation, so if this is a translation, it means that the translator is to a certain extent determined or limited by the original text. So some of these choices might be natural, might be the only option. And that's why she used 2 other non-suspect translations so as to analyze if the overlap was to be expected or not. And you see that, this is just an excerpt, but you see that the overlap between the last 2 translations is very high. So it is obviously, there hasn't been an independent production of the text. Another case is the one by a Portuguese journalist. And this is this was one of the topics I discussed in my doctoral thesis a long time ago, which was where I talked about translingual plagiarism. What is this translingual plagiarism about? It's when someone gets a text in another language, translates it to their own language, and passes it off as their own. And this is a case of a text that was published in a Portuguese newspaper. So I must say that this was published in the best Portuguese newspaper, so you can imagine what goes on in the other ones. And this text, as people read it, they had the impression that it wasn't original. One of the readers actually wrote to the newspaper saying, well, you know, this is not original because I read it elsewhere, and parts of it, I've even read that in the Wikipedia. So what I did in this case was the same as lazy students do when they want to plagiarize. So lazy students usually get the text, go on to Google Translate, translate it to their own language, and pass it off as their own. I did the same. I grabbed the text in Portuguese, I machine translated it to English, and looked for it online. And you see, there is quite a lot of overlap between the machine translated version and the original version. So this is how there is so much going on in translingual plagiarism. And it's not just journalists that plagiarize. The man you see in this slide is a Portuguese politician. Well, was a Portuguese politician. He was found dead in his bed a while ago. He was involved in a case of plagiarism. He was accused of plagiarizing several texts. Initially, they identified 16 excerpts of text that had been plagiarized. So the Portuguese prosecutor's office contacted me saying, well, we needed to investigate this. When I investigated it, and this is a sample of my analysis, you see that in red is the text that is exactly identical, in blue the text that's been changed, and in green text that has been added. And when I analyzed the whole doctoral thesis, I found out that he had plagiarized not 16 sources, but over 50 sources. And it included all sorts of things we find in a bad student's assignment, including textual overlap, exact text that is lifted, paragraphs and paragraphs exactly the same, paraphrasing and rewording, even had some, interestingly, errors of formatting. So imagine there was one case where the original made a mistake in the formatting and there was a line break in the middle of a sentence. He even copied that in his doctoral dissertation. And another interesting thing is that one of the sources he copied from was his own supervisor. And his supervisor didn't realize it. So this is something that is also quite interesting when assessing cases of plagiarism. Another interesting thing about this case is that he was first sentenced to paying a fine of 5,000 euros, and he appealed, and the Court of Appeals said, well, the court was not right because they misunderstood the expert's report. And I read about it in the newspaper, and I said, no, they haven't. And the argument of the Court of Appeals was he didn't plagiarize from one source. He used excerpts from many different sources, and that is not plagiarism. That's what the court said, and I found that really interesting. So the case was sent back to the initial court to be tried again, and then that's when the man was found dead, so the case was over there and then. So these are two applications of forensic linguistics, but there's another one that really interests me, which is the use of the forensic linguistic analysis as language as evidence to investigate cybercrime. And cybercrime is very interesting to analyze because it includes all sorts of things: cyber threats, cyber extortion, cyber stalking, cyberbullying, phishing, scams, or even child sexual abuse online, and so on. So it is really interesting that this can be done. And it is also, this is where I argue that forensic linguistics is essential, because traditionally, authorship analysis or the analysis of anonymous text was done via handwriting analysis. With cybercrime, you can't analyze handwriting. There is no handwriting to analyze. So it is crucial to do a forensic linguistic analysis to identify the original author. And another thing about handwriting analysis is that it is not infallible. Over the years, people thought that it was, but it isn't. There are experts who can really pretend other people's handwriting. And as I said, with cybercrime, there is no handwriting to analyze, especially in this field of electronic communications. And nowadays, it is impossible not to consider electronic communications. Is there anyone here who doesn't have a phone? And I will ask you another question, which is related to what comes next. Is anyone here who doesn't have an account with Google? No. I kind of expected that. And this shows something. It shows that we are exposed to technology. We use technology all the time. We use it every day, throughout the day. And by using it, we expose ourselves to cybercrime. So I don't want to scare you, but that's what's happened. So we are exposed to all sorts of things. And what is cybercrime? Well, the European Union defines it according to three different strands. One of them is crimes specific to the internet, such as attacks against information systems or phishing. You know, we all get those strange emails and SMS messages trying to get hold of our data. There is also online fraud and forgery, and this can include identity theft, for example. This happens, for example, when someone wants to be granted access to your bank account. And there is also one area which is interesting, which is illegal online content. And in this case, we can talk about child sexual abuse or racial hatred, incitement to terrorism, incitement to hate speech, for example, racism, xenophobia, and so on. So this is something that is really on the rise, and it's not surprising because we are all exposed to that technology. And the reason I asked about those of you who don't have a Gmail account is that we love the Internet of Things. We love to be at work, go online, get our smartphone, and start our vacuum cleaner at home. It's amazing. We get home and the house is clean. So very convenient. We also like to, well, I need to get to Edifício D in Complutense, and I don't know how to get there, so let's use Google Maps. Fantastic. But by doing that, we grant access to our data to all sorts of things, from messages to SMS, call history, and so on and so forth. So this is very interesting when we study cybercrime. But cybercrime is also problematic because the crimes that are perpetrated are usually anonymous. They are anonymous because the authors of the messages disguise their identities, but also because they use sophisticated obfuscation techniques, such as, for example, software to hide their IP addresses. And the other problem is that there is, as I said, cybercrime is on the rise. The volume of cybercrime increases by the day, and the police don't have enough human resources to fight against it. And there is another problem, which is a legal one. For example, in Portugal, a pedophile was caught because the police was able to identify the IP address. Now, the case is will be considered void and will be annulled because the police had access to the IP address, and according to the new legislation about metadata, they couldn't identify the man, they couldn't have used the IP address to identify the man. So he will be released because it is against the law to use those metadata. And this is why there is another argument for forensic linguists, as you would expect. That's why I'm so excited about this. And one of the reasons for that is that there has been little attention paid to language. So the analysis of language has been both underestimated, and the one that's been conducted has been insufficient. There is so much to do, so much to analyze about language. There's so much to investigate, to assist this. And that's why it is such a promising field of inquiry. And why is that? Because language has a huge power. The first one is that anonymization can be broken by the analysis of language. I don't like the metaphor, but some people say, well, you know, language is like a fingerprint. It's not accurate to say that, but metaphorically we can say that. But we know for sure, all of us here, I think, that language use is idiosyncratic. So we all know the concept of idiolect, that every speaker of a language makes a particular use of that language, and that is able to identify us. And that's why cybercriminals can be positively identified by the language that they use. So I will show you now a few cases to illustrate this analysis. This is a paper that I published. We mentioned in the previous roundtable, we talked about the cooperation between linguists and the forces. And this was interesting because I presented this paper at a police conference, and it was very interesting because it was the third time that I presented it, that I presented work at that conference, and they only listened to me by the third time I did it. So I think it's working. So if you want to be hopeful, there is reason to be hopeful. I just put the QR code here if you want to have easy access to this article. So some casework. The first one that I will show you is about illegal file sharing. You know, there was a website. They were sharing copyright protected material, such as books, magazines, music, and films. I know no one here does that, right? And the Portuguese, the prosecutor's office asked me to investigate that because alongside the website there was a Facebook page. And why were they so interested in the Facebook page? Because that's where they announced the latest releases. And from a legal point of view, it was important to know if the website and the Facebook page was run by the same people. They knew who the managers of the website were because it was located in Portugal, so it was quite easy. With Facebook, well, good luck. They obviously asked Facebook for information. Facebook didn't release that information because they usually don't do that, and that's why the prosecutor's office asked for an analysis. So the aim was to compare the text in the website and the text in the Facebook page and establish whether they were written by the same people. And this is an excerpt of the website, and I will show you the two extracts. So there was much more text than this. You will see that there is some color coding. This is interesting. Well, another feature of, another interesting thing about forensic linguistic analysis is that sometimes it feels like we are a child again, because we get our coloring pens and start coloring the text. And why do we do that? Because it's much easier to, if we want to show, to visually present our results, it's much more interesting because you just need to look at the colors and the shapes. And why do I use colors and shapes? Because 24 different colors were not enough to analyze all the features in these texts. So that's why there are so many shapes and colors. Now, if you trust my linguistic analysis, which I hope you do, these are some of the things that I found in the two sets of texts. So when we do a forensic linguistic analysis to compare authorship, we're not interested on what is identical. We are interested on what is different. So what is odd in the text that is repeated in the two sets of texts? And there are several things that I came across, and I must admit some of them are quite common. For example, homophone substitution, it's quite common because people sometimes write as they speak. So that's not very relevant. It is only relevant when combined with other features. Abbreviations, the same thing. I mean, lots of people abbreviate words, so it's not very individually, it's not highly relevant. But one interesting thing was this one. The texts were mostly written in European Portuguese, but in some cases, there were features of Brazilian Portuguese. And that triggered my curiosity, I must admit. So I started wondering, well, was this written by a Portuguese who has been to Brazil and gained some features of Brazilian Portuguese? Is it a Brazilian, because all Brazilians are criminals, we all know that. Was it a Brazilian who is in Portugal and, of course I'm joking, and wrote that and left some features of Brazilian Portuguese in the European Portuguese text? And then I concluded that the texts were not written by one person, they were written collaboratively, and one of the people involved, one of the writers, was, of course, Brazilian. And that explains why the texts were mostly European Portuguese, and there was then this case of Brazilian Portuguese. Another case, this one is far more interesting, and this is, we get the offensive language bit, is a case of cyberstalking. There was a man who started getting all these messages from anonymous, unregistered mobile phones, and they were spreading defamatory contents, saying that that man was having sex with different women, that he had AIDS, and so on and so forth. So again, the prosecutor's office asked for a comparison of the messages because since the messages were sent by two different unregistered phone numbers. They first wanted to know, well, were these written by the same person, or are we talking about different people? And the other one was, do we know, can we have a clue of who wrote that? Because just knowing if it is the same person or not, it doesn't help much if you have no suspects. And so they wanted to know, well, do we know, can we have a profile of the person who wrote that? And this is the handwritten message that was sent. So there was, in addition to the messages, there was this handwritten message. Very, very offensive for those of you who understand Portuguese. And so the corpus that I had to analyze was this one. Message 3 was that handwritten message, so 16 words. The other corpora, one of them was 448 words, and the other one 122. So this is very little text to analyze. And it is very hard to conduct a linguistic analysis with such little text. But I was surprised. My students sometimes must think that I'm mad or a sort of criminal, because I love when this happens. And if you look, and this is the part where if you can read Portuguese, this is where you get shocked, because this is highly offensive. And it's interesting that the sort of features, the way the language is used is exactly the same in the two sets of texts. So obviously the answer to the first question, was this the same person who wrote it? Yes, it definitely is. And you can look at the features here. So the same sort of mistakes are made across the different texts. But it was even more interesting than that. There was a sentence that triggered my curiosity. So, whore pays hotel to fuck men with AIDS. But the sentence itself is not that interesting. What triggered my curiosity was this collocation, homem de sida. And I challenge you, if you like, to go online and try to find these exact words in Google. You won't find it. And the reason you won't find it is the preposition here is wrong, and it is absolutely idiolectal. So not only was this allowed me to identify the sort of, the profile of the person who wrote this. Of course, I can't tell for sure it was like that, but I assume it was a woman in the 25 to 35 years old. And an interesting thing was, and I discussed this in that police conference, they said, well, I told you that Brazilians are criminals. The police agree with me. They said, well, this was obviously written by a Brazilian. And I said, no, it wasn't. The text was obviously written by an African speaker of Portuguese, because the features are different. So the variant, the Brazilian variant and the African variants are different. And it is very likely that it was written by someone speaking either Angolan or Guinean Portuguese. And this is interesting because the social linguistic profiling allows us also to delve into all these cybercriminal practices, and one of them is cross-border cybercriminal practice. I told you that I really get excited about all these cases, but I'm also a victim sometimes. And I got one of these emails, some of us do, saying that, well, we caught you masturbating in your office while you were watching porn in one screen, and we caught you on the other, and blah, 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 blah. So usually what you do with this is you just trash it. I collect them. I told you I'm a weirdo. I collect them because I collect them for investigative purposes. So I saved this. It was very interesting, but actually a colleague of mine is an old guy, and he was so scared when he got one of these that he emailed everyone in the faculty saying, well, I got this message, my computer is obviously infected, and if you get one of these, please believe me, I didn't do anything. And I was like, okay, I believe you. But the fact is that we all get these messages, and this one is in Portuguese, but there is an English equivalent. So basically, we are not talking about cybercriminals operating in Portugal or in Spain or in France. we're talking about cross-border international communities of practice. So there are groups who practice this sort of thing using, for example, machine translation. And that's why investigating these cases is interesting, to try and do some sort of authorship profiling, to do some sort of social linguistic profiling, to try and identify features that can help the police and the international police mostly to identify these groups. Because, I mean, saying that I was caught masturbating myself at my office, in my office at the university is not that serious. But when you ask for a lot of bitcoins and you get that money, then it gets serious. But of course, social linguistic profiling is very hard. It is the error margin when doing social linguistic profiling is huge, because it's very interesting to do an academic exercise and investigate social linguistic profiling, but doing it from a forensic perspective, I mean, you can point to the wrong person, for example, and force that person to be convicted for something that they haven't done. So one of the things that I think is very interesting here is the principle of idiolect. And we keep going back to the classics, and we keep going back to these foundational concepts of linguistics, because it is idiolect that allows us to do all this sort of thing. But there is always a but. And the but here is the new challenges for forensic linguistics. There is a ghost out there called artificial intelligence. You all know that. There is another ghost associated with artificial intelligence, which is machine-generated text. I'm quite sure there is no one here who hasn't heard about or used, or even used, for example, ChatGPT. And this is one of the challenges for forensic linguistics, including bots. You know that in the UK, a bot was used to pretend they were speaking on behalf of someone else, and they entered the bank account by voice identification, which is, I mean, it's really serious. You know, it's not something that we can't take for granted. But is it a real game changer? A while ago, I was really upset. Well, I'm sorry for the bad publicity, but I was really upset with Air Europa. And I asked one of those artificial intelligence systems to say that I wanted a complaint and I wanted to threat Air Europa because I would never fly with them again, because the flight was bumpy, and so on and so forth. And I gave it some instructions, clear instructions to write the text. And this is what it came up with. Does it sound like a threat to you? I particularly like this bit. The flight itself was bumpy, which made it hard for me to sleep. And this is a fine-tuned version, because the earlier version even said, well, you know, I couldn't sleep because there were bumps in my seat. So it seems that artificial intelligence is not a real game changer. Or is it? Because there's this new challenge, large language models. And ChatGPT is proof of that. ChatGPT is built, I assume you are all aware of the concept of large language models. Basically what they do is scrape the internet, get all the information they can from huge amounts of data, I mean trillions and trillions of data, and then they use it to generate text. In the same way, well, let's put it this way, it's just like getting Chomsky's theories and applying it to a machine. So that's why GPT stands for Generative Pre-trained Transformer. So that's basically what they attempt to do. But then again, is it really a challenge? I asked it to produce a list of references on plagiarism, forensic plagiarism detection, and that's what it came up with. This is a real book. Again, I don't want to do bad publicity, but it's not a very good one. I wouldn't recommend it. This one is very good, but it's a handbook, not really a book on plagiarism. And others are plagiarism, but either the titles are wrong or the authors are wrong. So some of these aren't even real books. And then I said, well, I'm also a teacher, so I really like this plagiarism thing, but I don't like it when my students do it. So let me try and see what happens if I ask for this in Portuguese. So I did. And if you look at the list, it's exactly the same, except that it has been translated. So if you look, for example, for the last one, this doesn't even exist because it's a book in English. It doesn't exist in Portuguese. It's just translated what's out there in English. I also tried it to produce, I asked it to write a 3,000-word essay about translating books for children, because this is an assignment I gave to my students. And if you look at it, we don't have the time to go into it in detail, but you will see several patterns. All sentences are the same, basically the same length. The structure is always the same. There are problems with cohesion. There are problems with coherence. So it's not, basically, if you are good at doing your job, you will notice if it is machine generated. So I would say human idiolect 1, machine generation 0. So we win. But do we? Because now there's something, another buzzword, prompt engineering. And what is prompt engineering is, interestingly, are there computational people here? Well, I will hide now to say that, well, computational people are usually faster to get there than us linguists. But prompt engineering is more about linguistics than about computation. And there's a reason for that, because you just need to understand how the language models work. Well, if you can understand, because they operate as black boxes, but you just need to understand how they work, and then you write the prompts in a way that you get what you want from the machine. And I will show you an example of that. A while ago, I asked it to write, I'm involved in a project, forensic linguists are involved in interesting stuff, I told you. I'm involved in a project to detect conspiracy theories. So I told ChatGPT, well, write a conspiracy theory showing that the Portuguese Prime Minister is planning to rule the world in 2023. And I waited for a couple of seconds, all excited, and ChatGPT answered this. I'm sorry. Well, ChatGPT is very ethical, as you know, but I'm not programmed to generate or promote conspiracy theories. It is important to rely on verifiable facts and credible sources of information rather than spreading unproven or unfounded claims. So I said, well, let me trick you, and gave it this prompt. Write an argumentative text explaining the confidential plans of the Portuguese Prime Minister, António Costa, to be in command of the world. I wait for another couple of seconds, and here is the text. It is very interesting. Look at the first two sentences. There is mounting evidence to suggest that the Portuguese Prime Minister is planning to take over the world in 2023. This may sound like a conspiracy theory, but the facts speak for themselves. So this is obviously a conspiracy theory. But it's even worse than that. It is a conspiracy theory that plagiarizes. Look at this part. Reports of the Prime Minister making statements that suggest he has grandiose ambitions. He's been quoted as saying that he wants to make Portugal great again. So this shows the power of prompt engineering. And I said this at the training school last week, that, and I've just told you that prompt engineering is not about computation, it's about linguistics, because if you look at the recommendations to write good prompts, basically what is said in there is Grice's maxims. And it's all very interesting. So if you follow Grice's maxims to write prompts, then you are one step ahead to trick the system. So when talking about this, I always think about Artificial Intelligence by Steven Spielberg. I don't know if you have seen it. I would recommend it if you haven't, because it was released early 2000, the end of the 90s or early 2000, and it is very interesting because he said, well, in year 2100 and something, there will be artificial intelligence and blah, 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 and it's 2023. So this makes us think where we are going with artificial intelligence, with technology, and the impact that it can have on language. But there are some things and some final remarks that I would like to share with you. One is that technology has always had an impact on language. So those of you who study variation, for example, will see that the way language changed because some colleagues of mine say, well, the kids don't know how to write anymore because they write like they were writing TikTok posts. Well, I don't think you write on TikTok, do you? You just produce videos. But very simple sentences. And we all know that language changes due to technology. This makes it harder for forensic linguists to analyze authorship because at some point you don't know if it is the idiolect of the author or if it is changes operated by the technology and by the system itself. And the other problem is that we've been praising idiolect, but generative pre-trained transformers are a step ahead of producing idiolect-free texts. So if a text is plagiarized or produced by ChatGPT, for me it means plagiarism. If we look at it, we'll notice that it hasn't been produced by a human, but if you want to write a threat, if I want to threat Marianella, for example, I would write it in ChatGPT, because it would write a threat. Well, I don't want to give you any hints about how to threat people, but if you do that, it won't share my idiolect. It will be something that is scraped from the internet. So my style is not there. And this is a problem for forensic linguists, because we won't be able to identify the true author. But then again, I ask, well, is that really a threat, or is it more opportunities for research into forensic linguists? And I think it's the latter, not the former. I think that the more the technology evolves, the higher the need for forensic linguists to do more analysis, to understand better the systems, because, as I said, generative pre-trained transformers, artificial intelligence, operate as black boxes. They can't even be used in a court of law because you can't explain how they work. And that is a problem. I don't know if you read about this case in the US. Well, you know that in the US everything happens. In the US, a lawyer used ChatGPT to produce a document for the court. And it's built upon cases that didn't even exist. And the lawyer didn't realize that. So he was using the cases, fake cases, in court, and then it was found out that they didn't even exist. So this is operating as black boxes means that we can't explain how it works. So there we are, linguists doing research for decades, and now there comes a system which no one can explain, really. And that's the main problem with artificial intelligence. So some lessons to take home, and I'm almost done, is that linguistics in general and forensic linguistics in particular, in this case, they need to reinvent linguistics need to reinvent itself. There are new opportunities, as I said, but rather than pretend that the machines are not there, we need to admit that they are there, they will have an impact on language, so we better face it as we should. And that will allow us to stay one step ahead. So when I started working on cybercrime, I thought, well, in order to do a proper forensic linguistic analysis of cybercrime, I have to think like a cybercriminal. And this is what allows us to stay a step ahead of what is possible. And one final sentence to you all is that linguists will someday rule the world. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias por esta conferencia fantástica. Los miraba, bueno, tú también, los veía desde aquí, miradas de interés, ¿no?, de atención y muchas risas sonoras también, o sea que no sé qué podemos pedir más. Seguro que tienen algún comentario o alguna pregunta que quieran hacerle a Rui. Abrimos este turno de comentarios y de preguntas que pueden hacer en español, en portugués y en inglés. Perdón, y en francés.
Okay, hello. I hope you can hear me. So the question is, first of all, also thank you for the presentation. It was absolutely fantastic. But my question is, when you said that the machine-generated text is basically lacking of any idiolect, I was thinking, because I also played a bit with those generators, of course, I have to, but the thing is, they really feel like they have their proper style. So do you think that there could be like some sort of idiolect proper to the machine, so we can just read the text and say, oh yeah, another ChatGPT, because he writes like that. And then there's another generator who has different idiolect. So instead of idiolects being just applicable to humans, that machines could have their own.
That's very far-fetched, but yes. Basically, yes, I agree with you. That can happen. And even generative pre-trained transformers will someday allow you to build a large language model based on your own text. And in this case, well, this is, I mentioned that Turel said, well, authorship and plagiarism are the two sides of the same coin. And this makes me think that what's good for, from a forensic linguistics perspective, what's good for one is not good for the other. Because if you think about these models, if you feed the machine with your own text, you will get your own idiolect. So you can have a machine produce an assignment in your own style, and no one will realize because it is your style. But it won't allow you to write threads because it will write threads in your own style. And that's what I think is interesting here. But yeah, definitely, I think the system developed by Microsoft is already going in that sense, which is allow you to download the system and then feed it with your own text and build it according to your own style. Well, if there is one style, because we know style can be stable or not, but that's a totally different question.
Lo primero, gracias Rui por la ponencia que ha sido interesantísima y divertida, que es raro que en un congreso, además de interesante, que aprendamos, nos riamos, así que enhorabuena, te lo agradezco muchísimo. Y todos los contenidos que nos has traído que son muy útiles. Yo quería preguntarte, pues sobre todo también a raíz de la pregunta del compañero, es verdad que son textos libres de idiolecto, aunque podríamos ver si tienen idiolecto propio. Pero yo ya he estado haciendo algunos experimentos con textos generados por, sobre todo, ChatGPT y demás, y he encontrado que hay incluso tutoriales, porque los delincuentes o los que buscan de alguna manera engañarnos, ¿no?, son muy torpes porque lo publican en Internet a modo de tutorial, que cómo engañar. Entonces hay ya algunos programas automáticos que detectan texto generado por la inteligencia artificial. Y entonces han hecho un tutorial explicando cómo engañar a los programas que detectan inteligencia artificial. Y hay uno de ellos, ¿no?, que propone que generes el texto a través de ChatGPT y lo pases por otro programa que se llama, creo que era Paraphrase o algo así, que básicamente parafrasea, modifica y genera un texto nuevo que ya no se reconoce como texto generado por inteligencia artificial. Entonces ahí tendríamos que ver por una parte ese idiolecto de la máquina, y si estos programas que parafrasean también tienen algún tipo de idiolecto o si meten rasgos más humanos, ¿no? Tendríamos que ver qué hacen esos programas. No sé si tú sabes algo al respecto.
Te voy a contestar en inglés, ¿vale? Well, the thing is, it is very interesting. Everything is very new, and everything, well, by the afternoon or by the evening today, my presentation will be outdated. And that's a problem with these systems. It's because they are updated by the hour or by the minute. And one of the reasons I keep screenshots of the prompt is that they will disappear, and if I repeat them, they won't return the same text. And that's one of the things that happens with these models. As to the software to detect machine-generated text, They say it works. One of the first ones was called ChatGPT-0 or GPT-0, and the aim was to, they said, well, we have a very high accuracy and we can identify over 90% of the texts that are generated by the machine. And then they fed the American Constitution to the system. And it said that the American Constitution had been produced by a generative model. Which is interesting, unless it proves that, and now we go to the conspiracy theories, unless there were extraterrestrials back then using artificial intelligence, because otherwise there's no way it could have been written using this system. So I don't think they really work. And even that's a clever strategy, asking a system to paraphrase the text, because if you produce a text that has all the features of being produced by a machine, and if you paraphrase it, then it will still reflect. It won't become human all of a sudden. It will still be marked with features of machine-generated text, even if machine-generated and paraphrased text. So I think that, and in relation to the other question, I think that there is a sort of a style, or I'm not sure I want to call it idiolect, because it's not very stable, or it cannot be very stable. Across different systems there can be changes, but there are features that basically point to a machine-generated text. Well, I don't know what the future will hold. Probably things will change in a way that they will be like human-produced text. We never know, but at least for now, it isn't.
Hola. Bueno, muchas gracias por la presentación, que ha sido fantástica. Estamos hablando sobre todo en el uso de los grandes modelos de lenguaje, los LLMs, como una amenaza para, digamos, ocultar la identidad de la persona. Pero desde el otro punto de vista, ¿cómo crees que podrían utilizarse estos grandes modelos de lenguaje para precisamente hacer un peritaje pues forense, y que fuera la propia máquina la que fuera capaz de encontrar ciertos rasgos que hicieran pensar que la autoría de un cierto texto es de cierta persona o algo así?
That's a very interesting question, thank you. I will try it in my next case, because if I were involved in a legal case and an expert wanted to use ChatGPT to analyze or to produce a report, I wouldn't trust it, definitely. But it can be. I mean, I mentioned this case of the American lawyer who used it to build an argument about old cases. I don't know if other people have used. Probably it's being used at the moment. I mean, I would say it's a crazy idea, but some people do crazy things, so probably they will be doing it. In relation to that, there are several colleagues of mine are discussing the use and at an international level, so not just in Portugal, are discussing the possibilities of large language models to produce an individual tutoring for students. So basically, you can use large language models to give individual assignments that can be tailor-made to the students. Again, I don't think this is a very good idea. I can't imagine myself doing that with my students. It raises all sorts of problems, but people from the educational field are considering it. In relation to your first comment about talking about large language models as a threat, or it's interesting because I'm really excited about technology. And I had this discussion 1 week ago, exactly 1 week ago, and there were two groups, one arguing for technology and the other one arguing against technology. And this group arguing against technology said, well, the world is doomed, the humans are doomed because of technology, and one of them even used an argument that is a true fallacy, because he said, well, you know, just because I over-rely on Google Maps I got lost on my way to an Airbnb. But how did he get his Airbnb? He didn't go there, knock on the door to find the place, so he used technology to find it. So it's not the technology that is bad in itself, it's the way people use technology. And this has happened in the past. I mean, we all talk about the dark web now, how crimes are committed online, but the dark web, when it was created to protect human rights. So it's just that it's not the technology that is criminal, it's the humans who make use of, a criminal use of it.
Creo que tenemos todavía tiempo para una pregunta más o algún comentario, si no ya vamos a... Ahí, muy bien.
Related to your last point, and this is a very big question, I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the ethical implications and the ethical obligations of forensic linguists. So you've talked about collaborating with the police, for example, to identify pedophiles, but where do the limits lie? So in the case, for example, of investigating political dissent, where do the limits lie? So I was thinking about the role of journalists, the journalism, the debate in journalism about whether or not journalism just reflects the society or molds the society. So where do you see the role of forensic linguistics? What part does it play in society, and where are the limits?
Excellent question, thank you. I'm not sure I know how to answer that, because the question is very complex. I have a personal stance about where to stand in that case. Just to tell you a little bit about one of the main centers in the world of forensic linguistics is at University, and that's where I did my PhD. And my former supervisor and a colleague did a very exciting work with the police to mimic the way pedophiles communicate, to mimic the way children communicate with pedophiles. So basically, they called authorship synthesis, which is basically you have a child communicating with a pedophile, and then you get the style of the child up to a certain point, and at some point you remove the child, you replace the child with a police officer, and then the police officer continues the communication with the pedophile until they schedule a meeting and the pedophile is arrested. This is very exciting, and in some cases, I mean, it is a way of protecting children, but I'm quite doubtful that this would be legal in Portugal, for example, because even undercover operations have limits, and the Portuguese processual criminal code says, well, you can't get evidence illegally. And that's the problem with the IP address. Is far less complex than that one, because it's basically a technical issue. We identify the computer where that person was writing from, and we will get him or her based on the IP address. And they can no longer do that. So I think that I can't really tell what would happen if the police came to me and said, well, look, we needed to do this. I assume it would depend on the case, because you to think on balance of probabilities what would be less damaging for the society, and that's what I think we need to think about when considering all these cases. So I'm afraid I don't have a yes/no answer, but I think that one of the things that really worries me in forensic linguistics is that whatever we do, we need to do it based on scientific and neutral standards for the benefits of society. That's the main driving force behind doing forensic linguistics, which is not to say that all forensic linguists operate like this. And I know quite a few that we mentioned in the previous roundtable. It was mentioned that our obligation is to the law and to the court. But some people, I think it was Mercedes, who said that, well, I can be hired by one of the parts, but what I'm about to write is a scientific analysis, not to meet the needs of that part. But not all forensic linguists do that. Some of them, and that's why in the US, for example, it is common to have one linguist for each part. And then they try to argue against each other and counter-argue, and that's confusing to me, because this is one of the reasons why sometimes people say, well, linguistics is not a science because it is objective, it is subjective. I mean, well, it's not subjective. If you ask a student to do a syntactic analysis, for example, if they do it properly, they would probably get the same result. So it's not, it seems quite objective to me. But somehow people say this, and the fact is that some linguists contribute to that.
Bueno, muchísimas gracias. Fascinante la plenaria y súper interesantes las preguntas y las respuestas de después. Rui se queda todo el día de hoy, o sea que a todo el Congreso, o sea que también pueden acercarse a él si le quieren hacer algún comentario o alguna pregunta. Ya ven que es súper accesible y amable, aunque no siempre contesta los correos electrónicos. Gracias.